This is a video of a voyage to the Marquesas Islands in French Polynesia. The Marquesas Islands are one of the most remote group of islands in the world. From our hotel room in Papeete, we could see the Aranui 3, our ship to the Marquesas Islands, tied up alongside.
The name Aranui is a compound Maori word, with Ara meaning path and Nui meaning great, i.e. great path.
At quayside, we were welcomed on board the Aranui 3, given a lei and serenaded. While waiting for the remaining passengers to board, we watched the landing craft and luggage being loaded aboard. As the harbor is in line with Tahiti's airport runway, we could watch aircraft taking off directly towards us while the waves broke on the reef at the far end of the runway. And in the foreground, ferries passed by on the way to Mo'orea. With all the passengers on board, we were entertained by a Tahitian cultural group which performed very energetic dances. Our trip to the Marquesas took us from Papeete through the Tuomotu Archipelago and then to the Marquesas Islands, where we hopped from island to island. Leaving the Marquesas, we returned back through the Tuomotus to Papeete. With the entertaining Polynesian dancing over, we were pushed off our quay to start our voyage to the Marquesas Islands. Exiting Papeete's harbor, we passed along the coast towards the Point Venus lighthouse before turning northwards towards the Tuomotu Archipelago. Out on the open water out of the harbor, we could look back and see the short distance between Mo'orea and Tahiti. Point Venus was where Captain James Cook set up to observe the transit of the planet Venus in 1769 to assist in a global effort to determine the distance from the Earth to the Sun. From Tahiti, we sailed north 24 hours to our first stop, the Takapoto Atoll in the Tuomotu Archipelago. After breakfast, we arrived off the Takapoto Atoll. The atoll covers a huge area with a length of 20 kilometers and a width of about 7 kilometers, but most of the atoll's area is covered by its large lagoon. The atoll has some 400 inhabitants. Many of the crew member, both male and female, had Polynesian tattoos, but the most remarkable crewman was called Mahalo, whose full-body tattoos reminded us of the character Queequeg, who is the son of a South Sea chieftain in the 1851 novel Moby Dick by Herman Melville. After landing, we walked through the atoll's main village called Papeete to a beach in the lagoon where we had lunch and time for swimming and snorkeling. The Takapoto Atoll has about 400 inhabitants, most living in the village of Papeete. Life in the village is unhurried and the houses modest. Like elsewhere in French Polynesia, the locals collect coconuts for the copra trade. We saw a dog on island time. It was symbolic of the islanders' laid-back attitude. After wandering through the village, we arrived at the beach where we had time to swim and snorkel before having a barbecued lunch. In the lagoon are the beautiful Tuomotu maxima clams. They have such diversity of color, vibrancy, and patterns that they are imported into the United States to liven up aquariums. The locals eat the clams, and we watched a family harvesting the clams and then chucking them on the shoreline to collect the clam meat. Departing Takapoto Atoll in the Tuamoto Archipelago, we sailed for 38 hours to reach Nuku Hiva, our first stop in the Marquesas Islands. The crew decorated the pool area with palm fronds for a reception. The Aranui 3 has a pool at the stern, and in rough seas it was fascinating to watch the water slosh about the pool. There was comfort in seeing the crew performing their fire drill. In the early morning light, a cloudy Nuku Hiva hove into view. Sunrise, we passed by a sailboat leaving Nuku Hiva for Uapo. Nuku Hiva is the largest of the Marquesas Islands, but it only has a population of about 3,000, which is dramatically down from the population at first contact by the Europeans in 1595. The diseases brought by the sandalwood and whaling industries killed 9 out of 10 Polynesians. At Nuku Hiva, we entered Tahui Bay. Docking at the quay in Tahui Bay gave us our first chance to see the crew in action using mooring lines to secure the ship alongside. Once the ship was secure quayside, freight offloading operations began immediately, and we went ashore to visit the town of Tahui and then into the interior to visit some of the other sites. Once in Tahui town, we visited La Cathedral Notre Dame. It was the first of the Polynesian Roman Catholic churches that we visited in the Marquesas. These churches are open air with beautiful wood carvings having a Polynesian theme to them. From Tahui, we drove over the sinuous mountainy roads to Tewa Kamui High, an archaeological site. We stopped at a beautiful overview of Tahui Bay, high up in the hills. Down in the bay we could see the Aranui 3 offloading its freight. Near Tewa Kamui High is a huge sacred banyan tree that had a pit underneath it in ancient times, where victims were kept until their turn arrived to be consumed at a cannibal feast. Under this huge sacred banyan tree, we watch a Marquesan cultural group perform dances. The Tewa is a large rectangular ceremonial plaza surrounded by raised stone platforms. The area was used for ceremonies and daily social gatherings. On the platform were important structures such as temples and chiefs' houses.
The pipeline has a simple structure. In the structure you have
In the forest near the Tewa are ancient petroglyphs on moss-covered boulders. The petroglyphs include glyphs of fish, turtles, and humans. Leaving Tewa Kamuehai, our next stop was Hatihu Bay. This is a small village where in 1888 Robert Louis Stevenson landed during his voyage in the Pacific. We had lunch at Hatihu in a small restaurant where they had prepared the meal in an umupuaka, or an earth oven. We were in time to watch them open the earth oven and reveal its contents of pork. After lunch, we hiked up to the small archaeological site of Mea Paenki. This site contains a number of carved stone tikis. Leaving Hatihu, we made the drive down into the Taipei Valley to meet our ship. Taipei Valley was where Herman Melville spent 4 weeks in 1842, having deserted his whaling ship in Taipei. Taipei was published in 1846, and it was Melville's most popular work during his lifetime and made him famous as the man who lived among cannibals. Our ship had steamed around from Taiohae into Taipei Bay, and that is where we rejoined her.
It's one small step for man.
Leaving Nuku Hiva, we sailed south to Uapo. It's only a short 50-kilometer crossing. Early in the morning we docked at the Hakaho Pier and immediately started offloading the freight while the passengers got up and went to breakfast. Uapo is the most dramatic of the Marquesas Islands due to the 4 high basalt pillars that reach high above the surrounding mountains. The highest of these pillars, Mount Ove, reaches over 2,100 meters above sea level and is the highest elevation in the Marquesas. At Uapo we were docked on a pier so we could walk down the gangplank and onto the island. While the unloading and loading operation continued, we went into town and first hiked up a steep hill to a cross, from which we had a wonderful view out over Hakahau Bay and could see the peaks in the interior of the island. The town of Hakahau is replete with blossoms and flowers of many different colors and shapes. At Hakahau, we were treated to a performance by a cultural group that did very dynamic dancing. Like many Roman Catholic churches we saw in the Marquesas, L'Église de Saint-Étienne had wonderful carvings in its interior. The highlight in this case was a pulpit shaped like the prow of a ship. The kids playing on the mooring lines provided entertainment as we returned to the ship. Leaving Hakahau, we sailed to Hakahetau. On our cruise to Hakahetau, we had excellent views of the beautiful basalt pillars in the interior of the island. Hakahetau is a small village of about 200 people with an equally small dock. While we were there, most of the village turned up to pick up their supplies brought in by the ship.
In 1787, the collection of breadfruit plants from Tahiti for transportation to the Caribbean was the goal of Captain Bligh and HMS Bounty. However, a mutiny prevented Bligh from completing his mission.
We walked around the small village of Hakahetau and up to a cliff that overlooked the Hakahetau Bay, where we could see the Aranui 3 in the distance loading and unloading supplies. The village's small Roman Catholic church has a wonderful setting with a backdrop of the basalt pillars in the distance. We sailed from Hakahetau about sunset, and so had wonderful views of the sun reddening the basalt pillars on the center of the island. Leaving Old Po, we sailed southeast towards Hiva Oa. Our first port of call on Hiva Oa was Atuona, which is famous because Paul Gauguin, the painter, stayed there at the turn of the last century. We tied up at the quay at Atuona on Hiva Oa very early in the morning, and offloading began immediately. It was fascinating to watch the crew offloading brand new automobiles in the dark under the ship's lights. At dawn we got a good view around Atuona Bay, with Atuona in the distance, under the shadow of Mount Temetiu at 1,200 meters. The offloading of goods continued in the day, and we could watch cranes shifting forklifts around from hold to hold to allow the goods to be moved about.
how the deck folds up?
As well as delivering goods, the Aranui 3 took goods out from the island. In this case, there were plenty of people on the dock bringing in their bags of copra to be weighed before they were loaded aboard the ship. We went into town on an aptly named Le Truck, but unfortunately the interior was freshly painted and we picked up red paint upon our clothing. The general store in town has a wide variety of goods, but they weren't cheap, as everything has to be transported in either by air or by ship. The town of Atoll has many beautiful blossoms and flowers to be seen around town. It's a good hike uphill from the town to the cemetery where one can find painter Paul Gauguin's gravesite. The oceanfront at Atoll is very rocky, but one does get an excellent view of Mount Tahuata. The Belgian singer-songwriter Jacques Brel lived for several months in Atoll, and after he died in 1978, his body was returned to the island and he was buried a few yards away from the grave of the artist Paul Gauguin. One of the main tourist attractions at Atoll is the Paul Gauguin Museum. The Paul Gauguin Museum has reproductions of many of his South Sea paintings, as well as a reconstruction of the Maison du Jouir, or House of Pleasure, where he spent his final years. It was a tight fit to get out of the quayside at Atoll, so one of the ship's barges helped push the ship around. Leaving Atoll on Hiva Oa, we made the short cruise to Vaitahu on Tahuata. On the cruise to Vaitahu, we passed by many wonderful beaches on the coastline of Tahuata. This was our first stop at Vaitahu, and we did not get off the ship. Rather, we stayed on board and watched the operations of loading and unloading underway. Later, we would return to the island of Tahuata and visit Vaitahu again, and we would be able to disembark. Leaving Tahuata, we sailed southeast towards Fatu Hiva, the most southerly of the Marquesas Islands that we would visit. Our first stop on Fatu Hiva was the small town of Omoa, with a population of about 600 people. At Omoa, we went ashore in a landing craft and then got off on the quay and walked around the delightful little village. Omoa has a nice waterfront location, and in the middle of the waterfront are two tiki sitting back to back. Near the tiki sculpture, we met a couple from Quebec traveling around the world. They were making their way across the Pacific by going from sailboat to sailboat. Omoa's Roman Catholic Church has wonderful carved interior. However, there is a bit of a termite issue also. Throughout our voyage, we had seen tapa prints in many locations. Now we would get to see how tapa was made. The first step in the tapa making process is to peel the bark off of the breadfruit tree, and then to peel the inner bark off the outer bark. Next, the inner bark is pounded to expand it. Then the water is wrung out. Finally, the inner bark is rolled up and then pounded again to make it almost double in size. At the end of the tapa making process is a cloth that feels and folds like a regular cloth. In order to use it to make a tapa drawing, they need to add starch to stiffen it. At Omoa, like many places in the Marquesas, the copra trade is used by the locals to make some money. Copra is the dried meat of the coconut. We passed by large racks of copra being air dried. The smell was wonderful. Leaving Omoa, the ship sailed up the coast of Fatu Hiva to Hanavave. Hanavave is a small town of about 340 people on the Bay of Virgins. This bay used to be called the Bay of Penises because of the fell-shaped basalt spires that rise on either side of its entrance. The head of the bay at Hanavave is very narrow, so there's good ways for the kids to body surf in. Before we watched the dancers, we watched a demonstration of how to make a traditional lotion out of coconut milk and flowers. Coconut milk is made by crushing the shavings of coconut meat. The highlight of the dancing was watching the next generation dancer being trained. We sailed from Hanavave around sunset, so we got to see the Bay of Virgins bathed in a wonderful golden light. We sailed north from Fatu Hiva to Hiva Oa, and that would be our second visit to that island. We were treated to many beautiful sunsets during our voyage. After darkness fell, we watched the crewmen fishing in the ship's lights. During our second visit to Hiva Oa, our first stop was Tuomotu, which is a small village of about 300 people on the north coast of the island. Coming into Tuomotu Bay, we were greeted by a beautiful double rainbow. The Aranui 3, which entered service in 2003, is to be replaced by the Aranui 5, which is being built in China. Apart from increased comfort, the number of passengers will increase from 208 to 254. During our voyage, we talked to one of the Chinese-American owners of the ship and asked why the replacement ship would not be called the Aranui 4. The answer was that in Chinese, 4 was an unlucky number. Once ashore at Tuomotu, we drove to Mea I'ipona, a temple complex in the jungle. After arriving at the temple complex, the skies opened and it began to pour down rain. The temple areas were sacred places and there were many tapus put on them. These tapus or taboos would include things like common people were not allowed to visit or see them. On the temple's large stone platform is the largest tiki in the Marquesas, at about 2.5 meters. This is the largest stone sculpture in Polynesia except for the Moai on Easter Island. The temple precincts also include a mysterious stone statue named Makii Taua Pepe. It is horizontal, so it is sometimes called the Flying Tiki, although exactly what it represents is not clear. We returned to the ship and then sailed westward along the coast of Hiva Oa to Hanavave. In Hanavave Bay is a blowhole that is constantly in action as the waves roll in. In Hanavave, where the stream runs into the sea, there is a pool where the kids love to play in. The valley that Haneapa is located in is very fertile and receives lots of rainfall, so throughout the valley there are plants of every description, both native and non-native. Leaving Haneapa, we sailed along the coast of Hiva Oa, and then sailed across to the island of Tahuata and to the town of Vaitahu. This was our second visit to Vaitahu, and this time we would get to disembark and explore the town itself. As this was Sunday, we were able to attend the Roman Catholic Mass in Vaitahu and listen to the wonderful choir singing in Marquesan. From Vaitahu we sailed northwards along the coast of Tuamotu to Koku, where we went ashore for beach time and a barbecue. The beach at Koku was wonderful, and it was a bright sunny day, but unfortunately the only shade available was under a coconut tree that was laden with ripe coconuts threatening to fall upon us. Leaving Koku, we sailed northwest towards Huka, the last of the major islands that we had yet to visit. We made a nighttime passage to Huka. At 5:30 we arrived in Hidden Bay on Huka. The bay is very narrow, and the ship had to perform a difficult maneuver in order to secure itself in the bay. The ship steamed into the bay, dropped anchor, and then swung about 180 degrees to face out to sea. Next, seamen in small boats pulled mooring lines out to the either side of the ship and secured them to bollards. These mooring lines were pulled tight to secure the stern of the ship into the bay. It was tricky and dangerous work for the seamen because waves continually came into the bay and broke against the walls of the bay where the seamen were working to secure the mooring lines to the bollards. With the ship secured in the narrow bay, soon the ship's boats were lowered into the water, and goods and passengers were soon delivered quayside. The waves were very active in the bay, so care was required when loading the landing craft prior to heading quayside. On the quay at Vaipei were many of the townsfolk there to pick up their orders. Once ashore, the group was split up to those who would be riding horseback and those who would be riding on the 4x4s for our tour of the island. Our first stop was La Mairie, where we saw a hula dance and visited a museum. The small museum at La Mairie had a number of interesting objects, including some beautiful carvings. Also at La Mairie was a souvenir shop where we bought a beautifully carved decorative paddle. Nearby La Mairie is the picturesque Roman Catholic church L'Église de l'Immaculée Conception. The interior has beautiful carvings. We drove on the windy road from Vaipei to Hanae, and along the way we stopped at an arboretum. The arboretum has a wide variety of trees found throughout Polynesia and the Marquesas Islands. It is hoped that one day trees from the arboretum will be able to be used to reforest Huka. We stopped to see reconstructed Marquesan buildings, and at the site there was a man blowing into a seashell horn. We briefly stopped at Huka and then went on to the small town of Hana. Both of them have a population of about 200 people. Le Musée de la Mer in Hana had an interesting canoe whose planks were stitched together with rope. From a hill over Hanavave, we watched the Aranui 3 come into the bay and start offloading goods. Due to the shallow nature of the bay, they had to use small ship's boats to deliver the goods into the town. There were many interesting things that came off the boats, including an outrigger canoe. Because there is no dock in town, all goods had to be manhandled onto the beach through the surf.
The guy went right on his back and pulled them out. Pulled back.
We got back to the ship early, and from the comfort of the ship we could watch the people on the beach struggling to get into the boats in the surf. As we left Huka to return to Nuku Hiva, we passed by a small motu that was covered by birds. During our return to Nuku Hiva, we had another glorious sunset before our Polynesian night began. For Polynesian night, we had an excellent buffet in the pool area before a dance performance by crew members. Our second stop in Taui was to pick up empty containers that had been left during our previous visit. We had a couple of hours in Taui, so we got off the ship and walked down to the visitor centers to stretch our legs. Along the shoreline we came upon some mud skippers, an amphibious fish that use their pectoral fins to walk on land.
Fish things.
Yes, that are like lizards, that they're fish.
At the visitor center are some interesting tiki sculptures. We re-embarked and were soon off to Uapau, again to pick up some empty containers that we had previously left there on our first visit to that island. It is only a short crossing to Uapau, so soon the distinct basalt pillars on that island hove into view. We carried some Marquesan passengers who were making the crossing either to Uapau or on to Tahiti. We docked at the pier at Hakahau and were soon off the ship and on to the beach. We had time for a swim in the bay while the crew loaded the containers back aboard the Aranui 3. While we were swimming, an outrigger canoe circled the bay as its crew trained. At Uapau, the crew loaded banana and other fruit onto the ship. They would take that fruit and resell it in Rangiroa to supplement their income. Leaving Hakahau, we sailed southwards along the coast of Uapau with its wonderful views of the basalt pillars and its interesting airport. The basalt pillars are extremely steep with impressive summits. Leaving Uapau, we left the Marquesas Islands and sailed southwesterly towards Rangiroa Atoll. It's a long passage from the Marquesas Islands to Rangiroa Atoll, so we had lots of time to kill. In the morning, we neared Rangiroa Atoll, the second largest atoll in the world. The Rangiroa Atoll is huge, covering an area of about 1,400 square kilometers. Its length is about 80 kilometers and its width about 32. Its highest elevation is only 12 meters above sea level. We entered the calmer waters of the lagoon through the very narrow Taputa Pass. The atoll has a population of about 2,500 inhabitants. Rangiroa's airport has allowed it to become a major underwater diving destination because of its lagoons, clear blue waters, and diverse marine fauna. We anchored in the lagoon, and the crew took their boatload full of fruit ashore to sell to the locals, while we went ashore for a barbecue and snorkeling on a beach. The beach where we landed for our barbecue and snorkeling was very beautiful, although the snorkeling wasn't that good. Some passengers left the ship to spend a few days in Rangiroa and then fly back to Tahiti. We saw a more interesting variety of fish on the barbecue than we did while snorkeling. We walked over to the ocean side of the Rangiroa Atoll, where the coral is evident and the surf pounds in. The Rangiroa Atoll, like other atolls in the Tuomotu Archipelago, is the home to cultured pearl farming. We visited the Gogans Pearl Farm on Rangiroa to see how Tahitian cultured pearls are farmed. The pearl oysters are raised in the ocean for up to 3 years until they are big enough to allow for the grafting process. The grafting process starts with the oysters being pried open and a wedge inserted. The wedged pearls are passed to a skilled grafter who implants a pearl nucleus made from pieces of shells that are harvested in North America. The grafter makes a small incision and the nucleus is inserted along with a small piece of mantle gland from a donor oyster. After the surgery is completed, the oyster is placed back in the water and allowed over several years to coat the nucleus with nacre, which produces the pearl's lustrous surface. After a couple of years, the oysters are harvested and about 50% of the pearls are marketable. We picked out a couple of pearls and had them mounted as earrings on the spot. Surprisingly, a vineyard on Rangiroa produces over 40,000 bottles of wine per year. From the Rangiroa Atoll, we headed southwest towards our final destination of Papeete on Tahiti. We exited the calm waters of the Rangiroa Lagoon, out through the Taputa Pass, and into the strong winds and choppy seas of the Pacific Ocean. Leaving the Rangiroa Atoll and the Tuomoto Archipelago far astern, we had another wonderful sunset, and then had a farewell supper with entertainment provided by crew members. We arrived back in Papeete around 6 a.m., had breakfast, and then disembarked the Aranui 3 for the final time. And so ended our voyage to paradise on board the Aranui 3 freighter.